I have filed 47 incident reports in my career. 47. I have documented equipment failures, supply chain disruptions, 2 near collapses of a forward operating station, and 1 deeply embarrassing situation involving Commander Vrithak and a malfunctioning atmospheric recycler that I am legally prohibited from elaborating on. None of those reports prepared me for this one. This report, the one you are reading now, the one that has been flagged, escalated, reflagged, classified, declassified, reclassified under a different color, and then handed to me again with a note that said, "Thessaly, just fix the formatting and we'll decide what to do with it later." This report contains a problem I do not know how to solve. The problem is not the battle. I have documented battles. The problem is not the casualties. I have documented those too, in the particular numb way you develop after the 3rd or 4th time you have to assign a number to what used to be a name. The problem is the footage. 41 minutes and 33 seconds of continuous combat recording from forward post Vecran 9, captured across 11 separate sensor arrays, cross-referenced with field audio, biometric telemetry from our own units, and the personal log of Staff Coordinator Drev Mal, who kept muttering, "I don't understand, I don't understand, I don't understand," into his recorder for a solid 8 minutes before someone told him it was still running. The footage shows one thing, and that one thing does not make sense. One human. One. A single organism from a single planet. Unarmed for the first 6 minutes. Then armed, but with things that were not weapons when she picked them up. Then surrounded. Then, and this is where the formatting problem begins. Then the surrounding became a different shape than surrounding is supposed to be. The surrounding became a retreat. 41 minutes and 33 seconds. I have watched it 11 times. I have watched the part near the end. The part where Commander Dreth Val, 30-year veteran, decorated officer, a being who once held a fortified position for 6 days against superior numbers. A being who has never in his documented career taken a step backward without a direct order. I have watched the part where he takes 17 steps backward and then stops and stands very still, and then says into his comm unit very quietly, "Log." I don't know what I'm looking at. I have watched that part 11 times. I still don't know what he's looking at either, but I'm going to try to explain it anyway, because someone has to, and everyone else keeps handing the report back to me. My name is Thessaly Coordinate Rho. I am a documentation officer. I drink a beverage made from synthesized grain husks that everyone tells me is terrible, and that I cannot stop drinking. And this is what happened at Forward Post Vecran 9. The first thing I should establish for the record is that I was not supposed to be at Vecran 9. I was supposed to be 3 posts back, in the secondary coordination hub, cross-referencing supply manifests and drinking my grain husk beverage and doing the quiet, invisible work that keeps a forward operation from collapsing into a pile of misfiled requisition forms. That is my function. That is where I am useful. What happened instead is that Staff Coordinator Drev Mal, who is technically my superior and who I have, on 17 separate occasions, watched walk face first into a pressure door because he was reviewing his queue while walking, decided that someone needed to physically hand-deliver updated tactical overlays to the forward post because, and I am quoting his message directly here, or the transmission encryption on the new overlays is giving me a headache and I don't trust the relay. He meant me. Someone was me. So I was at Vecran 9 with a data chip in my left pocket and a thermos of grain husk beverage in my right hand when the proximity alarm went off. And I remember thinking, in the exact half second before I understood what the alarm meant, this beverage is genuinely horrible, and I am going to finish it anyway. Then I understood what the alarm meant. At Vecran 9 was a small installation. Forward survey post, technically. The kind of place that exists to tell you something is coming before the something arrives. It sits on the surface of a moon with adequate atmosphere and completely inadequate everything else, and it is staffed at any given time by approximately 40 beings whose jobs range from critical to deeply unclear. The day in question, there were 38. 2 were on rotation leave. The proximity alarm indicated an Eton raiding party. The Eton operate in the contested corridor that runs through this sector, and they are not a group I have extensive documentation on, except to note that they move fast, they do not negotiate, and they have previously taken forward posts of comparable size in under 12 minutes. 38 staff. 1 documentation officer who should not have been there. Standard defensive equipment. No reinforcement for, I checked, 4 hours minimum. And that was the situation. I positioned myself in the eastern observation bay because it had a bank of sensor feeds that I could use to document, and a corner behind a structural support column that I could use to not be immediately visible. And I opened my thermos, and I watched the feeds, and I waited for the next 12 minutes to be very bad. The human arrived at Vecren 9-11 days before I did. Her name is in the report. I have spelled it 3 different ways across my notes because the phonetics of human nomenclature are genuinely not something my language centers handle gracefully, and Drevmal's handwriting is a diplomatic crisis unto itself. For the purposes of this account, I am going to refer to her as the operative, which is the rank designation she carried on her posted orders. Which said she was here on Joint Operations Familiarity Protocol, which is the kind of phrase that means something specific to someone and nothing at all to me. What I knew about her before the alarm: she had been present at Vecren 9 for 11 days. She had integrated with the survey teams without apparent friction, and she had eaten the communal meal on 7 of those 11 days, and reportedly made a remark on the 3rd day that caused station engineer Prelke to laugh so hard he aspirated part of his evening ration and had to be assisted by medical. I do not know what she said. It is not in any of the files. What I knew about her physically: she was, by the biological standards of her species, within normal range for size, which meant she was slightly taller than my shoulder and built in the bilateral symmetry that makes humans look, to my eye, like something designed by a committee that could not stop making things that match. She had the dark adapted eyes common to a lot of species that evolved in mixed light conditions. She wore her hair, the fibrous external protein filaments, which I know are non-functional but which I still find architecturally strange, in a tight coil at the back of her skull, which I later learned, from Staff Medical Officer Renatal, is a thing humans do when they expect to be in close physical situations and don't want the filaments grabbed. She had already been expecting something. I find that worth noting. The first contact wave came through the northern access corridor, which was the expected entry point. The Eton raiding party numbered, I pulled this from the biometric sweep, 22. They were armoured, which is standard. They were moving at the organised fast pace that means they've done this before, which they had. The Eton's operational record in this corridor is extensive and not favourable to the installations they visited. Our defence team locked down the primary hatch and fell into the standard response formation, which I was watching on the sensor feed and which I was noting in my log with the particular mental stillness I have developed for documenting things I cannot change. The human was not in the formation. I noticed this the way you notice a piece of equipment that is missing from inventory. A small snag of wrongness against an otherwise complete picture. The defence team had 12 members. I counted 11. The 12th slot, the one that should have held the operative's biometric signature, was empty. I scanned the other feeds. Eastern Corridor. Maintenance access, usually unmonitored. It runs along the outside of the installation's secondary shell. 1 reading. Small. Human range. She was in the walls. I want to be precise about what I mean by in the walls, because the maintenance access at Vecren 9 is not a metaphor. It is a literal series of crawl passages that run between the outer structural shell and the interior station walls, originally designed for equipment servicing and secondarily used by no one, because they are narrow, unlit, full of the kind of sharp edges that accumulate in spaces that are not meant to be occupied, and connected to the interior via panel access points that require a tool, patience, and the specific body dimensions of someone who does not mind being in extremely small dark places. She was moving through them at a pace that the biometric scanner read as purposeful. I watched her signal on the sensor map. I watched the Etten breach team on the other feed. I watched the two things moving toward each other from opposite directions, and I thought, very specifically, she is either doing something tactically sophisticated, or she has made a serious error and no one is aware of it. Then I thought, I should probably tell someone. Then I thought, the comms are being jammed, aren't they? They were being jammed. I drank some of my terrible beverage and continued to document. The Etten breach team cut through the primary hatch in 4 minutes and 30 seconds, which is faster than their documented average, and I noted this in my log with the sort of professional detachment that is, in retrospect, possibly a coping mechanism. What followed was not a battle in the sense I have usually documented battles. It was more like an argument conducted at high volume with physical punctuation. Our defense team held their corridor position. The Etten pressed forward. There was approximately 90 seconds of back and forth that ended with our team retreating to the secondary hold position, which was planned. The secondary hold position has better structural cover, and the corridor narrows, which limits the Etten's numbers advantage. Textbook. I've filed reports on this exact sequence before. What was not textbook was the sound. The Etten breach team had split, as they standardly do, sending a 4-member secondary unit to sweep the unmanned sections of the station, reduce the potential for flanking, confirm no assets in position, standard sweep and secure protocol. I watched the secondary unit on the sensor map moving through the eastern corridor, and I heard, through the structural sensors, because documentation equipment picks up everything, this is both its strength and its specific personal horror. A sound from inside the walls. A rhythmic sound. Soft. Almost inaudible. Consistent. It took me 4 seconds to identify it, cross-referencing against the audio files I have encountered in my career, the accumulated sonic data of 11 years of documentation work. She was humming. The operative, in the dark, in the crawl passage, moving toward 4 armed Etten soldiers. It was humming something that my translation matrix could not identify except to flag as human tonal pattern, recreational emotional register, classification, uncertain. I wrote in my log, she is humming. I looked at what I'd written. I drank more of my beverage. The first panel came off a maintenance access point directly above the secondary sweep unit's position at 14:33:07 station time. I have the sensor timestamps. I have the audio record. I have, and this is the part of the report I have reformatted 4 times because I cannot find a standard incident category for it. I have the biometric readings of the 4 Etten soldiers in the secondary unit at the moment the panel came off. All 4 registered elevated stress response. Not combat stress. The biometric profile for combat stress in Etten physiology is a known quantity. Elevated core temperature, accelerated circulatory rate, limb-focused blood distribution. So I've documented it many times. This was different. This was the profile that Etten biology generates in response to unexpected stimuli. The category our xenobiology files list as startle. 4 combat-trained soldiers, startled, by a panel falling. The operative dropped from the access point a half-second later. I am going to say here that I do not have perfect visual on what happened next. The Eastern Corridor sensors are older units, lower resolution, and the lighting in that section had been partially compromised by the breach team's initial EMP pulse. What I have is partial visual, biometric data, and audio. The audio is comprehensive. I can tell you that it lasted 43 seconds. I can tell you that the Etten secondary unit, which entered that corridor as 4 soldiers, exited that corridor, in the direction away from the primary engagement, away from their team, or away from their objective, as 4 soldiers who were moving with the biometric signature of beings who have made a decision about where they needed to be. The decision was somewhere else. The operative's biometric reading during those 43 seconds registered elevated cardiovascular output, which is the human equivalent of what I would charitably describe as significant physical effort, and a core temperature increase consistent with sustained exertion. And one thing that I flagged for the xenobiology team and that they have not yet explained to me, which is that her pain response indicators, the neural stress markers that track physical damage, those spiked twice during the 43 seconds and then did something that the monitoring equipment interpreted as a data error because it was not a data error. They dropped back to baseline. While she was still in the middle of it, I have asked 3 different medical officers about this. But the first told me I was misreading the data. The second told me the sensors in that corridor are unreliable. The third one was quiet for a long time and then said, "Document it and move on." I documented it. She came through the interior access panel into the Eastern Observation Bay, my bay, at 14:34:02. The panel is 3 meters above the floor. She came through it and landed without using her hands to slow the drop, which is physically possible and which I understand intellectually, but which I was not prepared to see at close range, and I made a sound that I'm not going to transcribe into the official record. She looked at me. I looked at her. Her lip was cut. There was something dark on her left forearm that my first aid training told me was a bruise accelerating to the surface, and that my documentation instinct told me to log. She was breathing at the elevated but controlled rate of something that has been working hard and is now deciding if it needs to keep working hard. She looked at my thermos. She said, and this is verbatim, I have the audio, "Is that coffee?" I said it was synthesized grain husk beverage. She said, "Close enough. Is there more?" I gave her my thermos. She drank approximately a third of it without reacting to the taste, which either means human taste perception is fundamentally different from mine, or she was too occupied with something to care. And she handed it back and looked at the sensor feeds on the wall, the ones I'd been watching. She looked at the primary engagement. She looked at the positions. She looked at where the Etten main team was, and where our defense unit was, and where the Etten's 4 secondary soldiers were now, and which was consolidating back toward the main team, retreating to their own unit. She was doing what I do, reading the map, finding the gaps. She said, "The North Junction. That's where their line is soft." I looked at the North Junction on the feed. She was right. The Etten's retreat of their secondary unit had created a gap in their flank positioning that had not been there 3 minutes ago. "You need to tell your people," she said. I told her the comms were jammed. She nodded, like this was information she had already filed somewhere. Like she'd already had the conversation in her head and was now 3 steps past it. She looked at the Eastern Corridor sensor, the one that showed her corridor, the one that was still showing 4 Etten biometric signals retreating. And she looked at the observation bay door, and she did a small motion with her jaw that my xenobiology reading tells me is called setting, the clenching of a specific facial muscle group associated with decided action. She handed me back my thermos. "Stay here," she said. "Keep watching. You're going to need all of this." And she went back through the panel. I stayed. I watched. I opened my log and I started typing. The grain husk beverage had gone cold, which is when it tastes the worst, and I finished it anyway. Because some things you do out of habit, and some things you do because it's the only normal thing available. And I needed something normal. I needed something I recognized, because what I was watching on the sensor feeds was no longer falling into any category I recognized. The North Junction. She was going for the North Junction, and the Etten, all 22 of them, the breach team, the secondary unit, the whole coordinated raiding party that had taken installations like this one in under 12 minutes, the Etten were about to find out that the gap in their line was not a gap at all. It was an invitation. She'd made it one. I wrote in my log at 14:36:44 station time. Something is happening that I don't have a form for. That is where part 1 of my documentation ends, because that is where everything I thought I understood about this situation stopped being useful, and something else started, and I am going to need a separate section to explain it. I am going to need several. Let me tell you what a gap in a line means. In tactical documentation, which is not my specialty, but which I have absorbed through 11 years of proximity to people whose specialty it is. A gap in a line means a position of weakness, a place where the pressure is lower, a place where, if you are the opposing force, you push through because the resistance there is thinner and the gain is faster. Every trained soldier knows this. The Eton know this. We know this. It is one of those pieces of knowledge so fundamental that it precedes formalized military doctrine by a considerable distance. It is something organisms figured out before they had the language to name it. A gap is where you go. What the operative understood, and what I only understood later, are watching the footage 11 times with the benefit of having survived the day, is that a gap is also where you put someone, not to push through, to be found. I had 4 active sensor feeds at this point. I was managing them the way I manage multiple input streams during complex operations, which is to say poorly and with the specific headache that starts behind my left secondary optical cluster when I've been staring at screens too long. Feed 1. Primary engagement corridor, north section. They're our defense team, 12, 11, they'd lost 1 to an arm injury, holding the narrowed passage. Eton main body, 18 soldiers, pressing but not breaking through. Standard attrition pattern. Feed 2. Eastern corridor. Empty. The 4 Eton from the secondary sweep unit had fully consolidated back into the main body. The consolidation had created exactly the junction gap the operative had identified. Feed 3. The north junction itself. The gap. At 14:37:09. The sensor was reading 1 human biometric signal arriving from the maintenance access system. Feed 4. Exterior perimeter. Nothing moving. The jamming was still active. No reinforcements? Not yet. I was watching all 4. I was also writing, because that is what I do. That is the thing I have that makes the watching bearable. If I am describing it, it is slightly less like drowning in it. The operative entered the north junction at 14:37:14. I wrote, "She's in position." And then I wrote nothing for 3 minutes and 12 seconds, because what happened next required my full attention, and I could not split it. The Eton main body noticed the gap at 14:37:31. The way I know this is that their biometric profiles shifted. Not dramatically, not the sharp spike of combat alarm, but the slower, coordinating change that indicates tactical reassessment. The change that means something has changed in the picture, and we are adjusting. 2 soldiers peeled off from the main press, sent to investigate and exploit. Standard, textbook, correct military decision. The operatives' biometric reading, as they approached the north junction entrance, baseline, not elevated. Not combat-ready elevated. Not even mildly stressed elevated. Baseline. Either the sensors were wrong, and I have already addressed the theory that the sensors were wrong, which is that it doesn't explain what came next. Or she was standing in that junction in the dark, listening to 2 armored soldiers approach her position, and her body was doing something that mine would not do in that situation, something I do not have a precise word for in my language, but that the human files I consulted later described with a word that translated imperfectly as settling, like water finding its level. Like something that has stopped arguing with the situation and started operating inside it. The 2 Eton soldiers entered the junction at 14:38:03. What happened in the next 40 seconds I am going to describe from the audio because the visual sensors in the north junction are ceiling mounted and caught angles that were not useful, and because the audio tells the story with a specificity that I think the visual record would have diluted. There was no shouted warning, no challenge, no exchange. There was sound of movement, not chaotic, not the scramble of surprise contact, but rhythmic, directional sound that I can only describe as intentional. She was moving in a way she had chosen. Every impact, every shift of position was something she had, in some internal sense, I am still trying to understand, already decided. The 2 Eton soldiers lasted 19 seconds each. They did not last the same 19 seconds. Consecutive, not parallel. As I note this because it matters. The second one knew what had happened to the first one. Knew it, heard it, had the information, and it did not change the outcome. I find that detail the most difficult to process. At 14:38:52, the North Junction sensor registered 1 human biometric, 2 Etten biometrics, elevated stress, reduced mobility indicators. Reduced mobility is documentation language. What it means is they were not moving. She had put them down. Not dead. I want to be precise. The biometrics confirmed survival. But out. Out of the engagement. Out of the equation. With her hands. In the dark. I looked at my empty thermos. I picked it up. I put it down. I picked it up again. There was nothing in it, and I tilted it anyway. The way you do when the action of the thing is more useful than the result of the thing, and I thought, 17 days ago, I was cross-referencing supply manifests. The main body registered the loss of their 2 flanking soldiers at 14:39:14. And I could see it on feed 1. A brief disruption in their press pattern, a micro pause that probably lasted half a second in real time, but that the sensor caught because sensors don't blink. The Etten commander, I identified her by position, the center of the formation, the one the others oriented toward, held position, made a decision, sent 3 more, because 3 soldiers for 2 incapacitated. That's an escalation. That is the Etten saying, we know what happened, and we are sending an answer that accounts for what happened. 3 was the calculated response. I watched the 3 soldiers move toward the North Junction. I watched the operative's biometric reading on feed 3. Still baseline. I added a note to my log that said, this is not normal. And then I crossed it out because of course it wasn't normal. I was watching it happen. I was the documentation officer. The note was not useful. So I wrote instead, observe and continue. Observe and continue. It's what I always write when I don't know what I'm looking at. It is a very short sentence that does a great deal of work. Here is what I didn't understand at 14:39:14 that I understand now. The operative was not fighting a battle. She was not even, in the tactical sense I had been trained to recognize, conducting a defensive operation. She was conducting a demonstration. Not for us, not for me, watching the feeds, not for our defense team holding the primary corridor, for the Etten. She was talking to the Etten in the only register that the situation made available, in the language of consequences, and she was being very clear, and she was being very patient, and she was saying the same thing over and over with her hands and her body and her 43-second sequences in the dark. I am still here. I am still here. I am still here. The 3 soldiers entered the North Junction at 14:40:01, and they exited at 14:41:08, in the direction away from the main body. I want to be precise. They walked out. Not running, a pace that the sensor read as deliberate. They walked out of the junction and down the eastern corridor, and they did not stop walking until they reached the exterior access staging area. And then one of them activated a personal comm unit. The jamming was Etten equipment, and Etten equipment doesn't jam Etten comms, and said something that my translator matrix caught as call sign requesting extraction. Call sign is reporting, untranslatable at this coordinate. The untranslatable part, I have submitted it to the Xenolinguistics Division 4 times, and the first 3 submissions came back with notation, context insufficient. The 4th came back with a note from a junior analyst who said, and this is in my file, best approximate translation is a type of problem we don't have the category for. A type of problem they didn't have the category for. 3 soldiers walked away, called for extraction. I wrote in my log, something is changing. The main body registered the second loss at 14:41:20. This time, the micropause was not a micropause. The Etten formation, which had been pressing our defense team with the coordinated confidence of a unit that knows the math is in its favor, 18 versus 11, structured, trained, experienced, the formation stopped. I watched it stop on feed 1. Watched the biometrics of 18 soldiers shift in a way that I have, after 11 times reviewing this footage, learned to read as collective. They were communicating, not with words. The comms were all active, but this was faster than words. This was the kind of information that passes through a unit that has been together long enough to share a nervous system. The kind that moves at the speed of everyone already knows. Everyone already knew. Their 3 soldiers had walked away. Not been taken. Not disappeared. Walked away. Filed a report. The Etten commander was still in the center of the formation, still the orientation point. And I watched her biometrics with the specific attention I now reserved for her readings. And she did something that my xenobiology reference files told me, when I checked later, is an Etten command posture called re-evaluation stance. She was reassessing. Her soldiers felt it. The whole formation felt it. And when a commander reassesses in the middle of a push, the formation that felt their 3 colleagues walk away rather than be carried away, that formation does a thing. It pays attention. The operative came out of the North Junction at 14:42:33. She came out into the main primary corridor, which is where the engagement was. She walked out. Not from a panel, not from a wall. From the junction entrance into the corridor. And she stood there. And the Etten formation and our defense team were both visible to her from that position, and she was visible to both of them. I am watching the sensor feed here as I write this. I have watched this section 11 times. What I am looking at, every time, is the same thing. She stopped. She put her hands, both of them, down at her sides. Not raised, not holding anything, not in any position that the Etten would code as threat display. She just stood there. The biometrics of the formation, all 18, spiked in the precise pattern I described earlier. Not combat stress, startle. 18 combat veterans. Startled by a woman standing still. The Etten commander's reading separated from the groups. Individual processing. Or her own calculation. Our defense team, 11 of them holding the narrow corridor, went very quiet on the audio. I could hear, on the directional mics, the specific quality of silence that happens when people stop moving, because they are waiting to see what the person who seems to know something is going to do next. The operative looked at the Etten formation, and she said something. It is in the audio file. My translator matrix gives me 54% confidence on the translation, which is low, which means either her pronunciation of the Etten trade dialect was imperfect, or the translator matrix is inadequate for the register she was using. The 54% translation is, "You've seen the part where I don't stop. Now you should go." The Etten commander held position for 7 seconds. 7 seconds is a long time in a corridor where everyone is armed and no one is moving. Then she made a sound that my Etten reference files categorized as a command vocalization, and her formation shifted, and they began the consolidation movement that means an organized withdrawal. They left the way they came in. All of them. The 2 in the North Junction were recovered by their colleagues on the way out. Carried. Our defense team let them carry their people out. I do not know who made that call. It may have been no one. It may have been a decision that happened in the collective silence the way those decisions sometimes do. But they let the Etten retrieve their wounded and leave. The exterior perimeter showed the full party clearing the installation boundary at 14:47:09. The jamming stopped at 14:47:31. My comms came back online at 14:47:32, at which point I received 17 queued messages from Drev Mal about the tactical overlay data chip I still had in my left pocket and had not delivered. When I found the operative in the Eastern Observation Bay at 14:48. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the sensor console, in the corner near the structural support column that I had been using as cover, and she was looking at the ceiling, and her hands were resting flat on her thighs, and her eyes were open. I sat down next to her, because the floor seemed like the right altitude for this moment. I opened my thermos. There was still nothing in it, and I looked at it for a moment and put it back down. She said, "How long until backup?" I said, "3 hours, roughly." She said, "That's a lot of time." I said, "Yes." She didn't say anything else for a while. Neither did I. Outside, through the structural sensors, I could hear our defense team beginning to move. Voices, footsteps, the specific quality of sound that a group of people makes when they are collectively coming down from the edge of something. Someone was laughing. The high, slightly unsteady laugh of relief. I was watching the operative's biometric reading on the console above us. I could see it from where I was sitting. It had finally moved off baseline. A little, just a little. A small elevation in the stress markers, late, arriving now that the corridor was clear and the formation was gone and there was nothing left to settle into. Her body, apparently, had been saving that. I looked at the corner of the ceiling. But I thought about the 43 seconds in the eastern corridor, and the 3 soldiers who walked away, and the 7-second pause before an Etten commander ordered a withdrawal. And I thought about all the forms I was going to have to file, and the categories that were not going to fit, and the report that was eventually going to land on someone's desk with a note that said, "Figure out what to do with this." I thought about the word my translator matrix couldn't find. A type of problem they didn't have the category for. I thought, yes, that. I thought, I'm going to need to invent some new categories. I picked up my thermos, put it down, picked it up. She glanced at it, then at me. Something moved in her expression that I did not have the reference files to name precisely, but that I recognized, the way you recognize a thing that belongs to a register of experience wider than your own. "You okay?" she said. I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I said, "I am going to have to file a very unusual report." She made a sound, not quite a laugh, something adjacent to it, from the same region. "Yeah," she said, "sorry about that." She didn't sound sorry. I noted this in my log. Here is the part of the report that took me the longest to write. Not because of the events. The events I can document. The events have timestamps and biometric signatures and audio files and sensor cross-references, and all of those things exist in a format I understand and can organize and can hand to someone else to review. What took me the longest is the part that came after. The part that belongs to the weeks following the incident at Vecrin 9, when the report was filed and flagged and escalated and handed to people with more authority than me, and then handed back and handed up again, and eventually deposited on the desk of the Sector Command Review Panel, who looked at it and did what review panels do, which is to say they convened and deliberated and requested additional documentation and ultimately produced a summary statement that I have read 4 times and that I believe represents their genuine best effort to say something accurate about a thing they did not quite know how to contain. And the summary statement said, "Incident at Vecrin 9 indicates need for updated assessment protocols regarding joint operations human personnel. Recommend expanded integration review. See attached." The attached was 40 pages. I wrote 37 of them. The other 3 were written by Commander Drethval, which I will address shortly, because those 3 pages are the reason this account exists in the form you are reading it in. And they are the thing I keep returning to when I try to understand what the incident at Vecrin 9 actually means versus what I can document that it means. Those are 2 different things. That gap between them is where I live now. The reinforcement team arrived at Vecrin 9 at 18:03:41, which was 3 hours and 16 minutes after the Etten withdrawal. In that time, the following happened. Station Engineer Prel K, whose arm injury from the primary engagement was a deep laceration that medical had closed with a field kit, sat in the corridor where the engagement had been and sorted the spent charge casings into size order. He is not the type of person who does that. I have known him peripherally for 2 years, and I have never observed him engage in any organizational behavior voluntarily. And Staff Medical Officer Renital told me later that it is a thing stressed beings sometimes do when the stress has nowhere left to go. Sorting things, making order out of the smallest available pieces. I understood that. I did not say so. Our defense team did not celebrate. They were quiet in the way that people are quiet when they have used every part of themselves and are now waiting for the systems to replenish. Someone made a hot beverage. Real hot beverage, the good kind. Not mine. And passed it around and didn't say much. And the sounds they made were small and careful, like beings relearning the size of normal. The operative moved through all of this without being in any of it. Not distant. She stopped and spoke when she was spoken to. She helped one of the younger defense team members find a chair when the adrenaline dropped and her legs stopped working properly. But she was not part of the group's particular silence, though she existed in a different register of the aftermath. Something in her was already past it, already back to baseline in a way that the rest of us were still working toward. I watched her the way I watch everything, which is from a slight remove, with a log open somewhere in my mind. And I thought, this is the thing the Ettin's translator couldn't categorize. Not the physical capability, not the tactics. This quality of being done with a thing and present for the next thing, without the transitional noise the rest of us seem to require. I don't have a name for it either. Commander Drethvol arrived with the reinforcement team. He was not supposed to be with the reinforcement team. He is a senior command officer, a 30-year veteran of the sector's contested corridors, and his presence on a resupply reinforcement run to a forward post is the kind of thing that does not happen without a specific reason. The specific reason, I learned later, was that he had been monitoring the situation remotely from the moment the jamming dropped, had seen the preliminary sensor reports as they were transmitted, and had made a decision. He wanted to come himself. I have worked adjacent to enough command-level officers to understand the weight of that. A 30-year veteran does not personally travel to a small forward post that has already resolved its crisis because the paperwork requires it. He comes because he has seen something in the reports and he needs to see the something with his own visual organs before he decides what to do about it. He arrived at 18:03:41. By 18:07, he had done a full walkthrough of the station, reviewed the sensor data on site, and positioned himself in the Eastern Observation Bay with his personal log recorder running. I know this because I was still in the Eastern Observation Bay, still in my corner. Moi still working on the preliminary incident documentation, still periodically picking up my empty thermos. He did not ask me to leave. He did not acknowledge me, specifically. He stood in front of the sensor console and he looked at the feeds which were now showing an empty station exterior and a clear perimeter and nothing that needed watching. And he ran the playback. I watched him watch the footage. He was very still. He is always still. It is one of the things his reputation rests on, was the quality of stillness that experienced officers develop. The kind that means the calculation is happening inside and not leaking out. But this stillness was different. This was the stillness of a being who has encountered something that is reorganizing the furniture inside their head and is waiting for it to stop moving before they speak. At 18:24:07, he pressed record on his personal log. He said, "Log. I don't know what I'm looking at." He said it the way you'd say something you were thinking anyway. That got out before you decided whether to say it. He didn't say anything else. He stopped the recording. I kept typing. The Ettin filed their own incident report. This is not unusual. The Ettin have a formal operational documentation protocol that they share, in summarized form, through the sector's joint observation channels. And this sharing is part of the contested corridor agreement that prevents the situation from escalating beyond raiding and response into something that requires a different kind of paperwork. I received the summarized Ettin report 4 days after the incident. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph described the operation. Raid on Forward Post Vecran 9. Entry at 14:29 station time. Engagement with defense personnel. Subsidiary sweep of station sections. And the second paragraph described the withdrawal. Ordered withdrawal at 14:47:09, following operational assessment indicating conditions unfavorable to continued engagement. That is how they phrased it. Conditions unfavorable. I have read a considerable number of ETN operational summaries in my career, and this is a phrase they use for things like structural instability, equipment failure, unexpected reinforcement, weather events on open-air operations, not for raids on 38-person forward posts. The third paragraph was where the report became the thing that I kept returning to. It said, "Station contained combat classified human operative, exhibiting untranslatable behavioral indicators. Assessment panel recommends formal notation for future operational planning. Operative is flagged in our system under designation untranslatable." 2 untranslatables in one paragraph. I submitted it to the Xenolinguistics division. And this time, the turnaround was fast, under 24 hours, which tells you something about how the division had by then become aware of the Vecran 9 situation. The first, untranslatable, a quality of readiness that does not diminish under pressure. The second, the designation they had flagged the operative under. The analyst said the most literal translation they could construct was, "the one who is still there when the thing is over." I stared at that for a long time. Then I added it to the report. I spoke to the operative once more before she was reassigned. It was 2 days after the incident, the morning of her departure, and she was in the station's equipment prep area doing the final check on her kit with the systematic attention she gave to everything physical, methodical, no wasted motion, the kind of thoroughness that comes from somewhere practical rather than somewhere anxious. I had my draft report on my data unit, but I had been carrying it for 2 days. I told her I had a documentation question. She said, "Sure." I said, "The secondary sweep unit, the first 4, the 43 seconds. I need to understand, for the report, for the categorization, what you were doing in there." She looked up from her kit. She thought about it with the particular quality of someone who is not deciding whether to answer, but how. She said, "Managing the problem." I said, "Managing how?" She said, "There were 4 of them and 1 of me. I couldn't have 4 problems at once, so I made sure I was only ever solving 1. I said, "And the humming." Something moved in her face. The adjacent to a laugh thing. "If I'm scared," she said, "the humming reminds me where I am." She said it like that was the most basic thing. Like it was obvious. Like she was explaining to me where the station commissary was located. Where I am. I wrote it down on the open report file. I'm not sure yet where it belongs in the formal structure. I haven't found the right section for it. Commander Drethval filed his 3 pages with the review panel on the 9th day after the incident. I was given access to them as part of the compilation process because my name was on the primary report and they needed the full file cohesive. The first page was operational assessment, standard format. He documented the incident timeline, cross-referenced it against the sensor data. I noted the ETN withdrawal and its triggers, and assigned the tactical outcome to the operative's actions in clear command language. The second page was recommendations. He recommended the expanded integration review that the panel ultimately put in their summary. He recommended updated assessment protocols. He wrote, and near the bottom of the second page, recommend all forward post commanders in the contested corridor receive notification that human joint operations personnel may possess capabilities that existing classification systems do not adequately capture. That sentence had been edited. I could see the revision marks. Something had been removed from it. I don't know what the first version said. The third page was not in the standard format. It was not addressed to the review panel. It was not labeled. And it did not have a header or a classification tag or any of the formal markers that command documentation requires. It was just text, and it had not been filed with the main document. It was attached separately, with a note that said, "Include this in Commander Drethval's handwriting," which is nothing like Drethval's handwriting, which is legible and considered, and each word placed like he thought about it before he put it down. And the third page said, "I have held positions under pressure for the better part of 3 decades. I know the shapes that pressure makes. I know what it looks like when a being is managing fear versus running on it. I know what it looks like when the math has gone wrong and a soldier knows it. What I watched in the sensor footage from Veteran 9 was not that. I have been trying to find the right frame for it since I watched the playback. I've been in this observation bay for 2 hours. I've watched the 43 seconds in the Eastern Corridor 11 times, and the North Junction sequence 9 times. And the moment she walks out into the primary corridor, that moment, I've watched that moment 7 times, and I still cannot tell you what the correct frame is. She wasn't managing fear. She wasn't running on it. She was operating in a register that I don't have a designation for, that my 3 decades have not given me a frame for, and I want to be very clear that this is not admiration, that I am not writing this as a commendation, that I am writing this because the incident review should contain the honest assessment of every senior officer present. My honest assessment is, I don't know what she is. I know what she is not. She is not a type of soldier I have encountered before. She is not a combatant whose methodology I can map onto existing doctrine. But she is not a being who appears to be operating under the same relationship to danger that I have observed in every other soldier I have known in 30 years. At 14:42:33, she walked out of that junction and into the primary corridor and stood still. And I watched the Eton commander hold position for 7 seconds. I know what that 7 seconds means. 7 seconds is a command officer doing math they do not want to be doing. 7 seconds is a 30-year veteran standing in front of a problem they did not expect and running the numbers and arriving at a conclusion that they do not like. The conclusion that Eton commander arrived at is the same conclusion I arrived at watching the footage. I am not going to write it in this report because I don't think I've earned the right to say it about someone else's soldier. I will say this: the designation the Eton gave her is correct. Log it as you see fit. I read that 3 times. Then I sat with my empty thermos for a while. There is a word, not in my language, not in the Eton trade dialect, not in any language that I speak, that I have been building in my head for 9 days, constructed out of pieces. The 43 seconds, and the baseline biometrics, and the hum in the dark, and where I am, and the 7-second pause, and the designation in the Eton report, and a 3-page attachment filed by a 30-year veteran who had the authority to leave the 3rd page out and didn't. I don't have the word yet. I am still building it. The operative shipped out on the morning transport as scheduled. I was at the exterior access point because I had a transport manifest to collect, which is a mundane thing, a thing that happens every time any personnel moves through any post, a thing with a form I know, and a signature field and a timestamp. And she signed the manifest, handed it back. She picked up her kit. I said, "The report's going up to Sector Command." She said, "I know." I said, "There's a lot in it they won't know what to do with." She said, "I know that too." I said, "They're going to want to study you." She looked at me, and she did the thing with her jaw. Not the setting thing, the decided action thing. Something else. A relaxation in the same muscle. Something like, "This is not the worst thing that has ever been true." She said, "Let them." She walked to the transport. She did not look back, which is either a human custom I don't have enough data on or a particular thing about her, specifically that I am going to keep in the file and think about later. The manifest is in my left pocket. The data chip with the tactical overlays, the whole reason I was at Veteran 9 in the first place, is still in my right pocket. I never delivered it. Drev Mal has sent 8 messages about it. I have been meaning to respond. I have been filing the incident report instead, and reformatting it, and adding attachments, and finding the edges of the categories I have, and marking the places where they end, and the new categories need to begin. I have been doing this for 9 days. My grain husk beverage has run out. I ordered more. It will be terrible, and I will finish it anyway, because some things you do not stop doing just because they are not good for you. And some things you keep doing because they are the only thing available that tastes like where you came from, and I am a documentation officer from a sector that was not contested until 8 years ago and is contested now. And the report on my unit is going to reach people with more authority than me, and they are going to do something with it, or they are going to hand it back and ask me to fix the formatting. And while I wait to find out which, there is a word I am building. One piece at a time. The piece I keep returning to is small. It's what she said, sitting on the floor with her hands flat on her thighs, looking at a ceiling that had nothing useful on it. If I'm scared, the humming reminds me where I am. Where I am. Not who. Not what I'm doing. Not what comes next. Where. Present tense. This coordinate. This moment. This floor. I don't know what you do with that. I don't know what category it belongs in. I don't know whether Commander Drethval has a word for it either, or whether the Etten commander who held position for 7 seconds has a word for it in her language. I know what the Etten called her in their report, the one who is still there when the thing is over. I think that's close. I don't think it's the whole thing. I'm still looking.